45 people boarded a plane that would vanish into the Andes. It was October 13th, 1972. The aircraft departed from Mendoza, Argentina, bound for Santiago, Chile. Among the passengers were young rugby players from the Old Christians Club, traveling with friends and family. What began as an ordinary flight would soon become one of the most extraordinary survival stories ever recorded. As the plane climbed into the mountains, the Andes rose like a frozen wall. Jagged peaks pierced the clouds. Violent winds battered the aircraft as turbulence rippled through the cabin. High above the snow and ice, danger closed in from every side. For those drawn to deeply researched stories of survival, human endurance, and history's darker mysteries, this channel releases new documentaries every week, each one exploring what happens when ordinary people are pushed to the edge. Because what happened in those mountains was more than a crash. It was a test of endurance, faith, and the limits of what people will do to survive. Cut off from the world, trapped in a frozen wilderness, forced to confront choices no one should ever have to face. What followed would shock the world and redefine what survival truly means. This is the miracle of the Andes. After departing Mendoza, Argentina at 2:18 p.m., the Fairchild FH-227D carried its passengers toward the Andes. What should have been a routine flight quickly became treacherous. Afternoon crossings in these mountains are notoriously dangerous. Thermal mixing of warm and cold air creates turbulence that seasoned pilots avoid, preferring early morning flights. But a prior weather delay in Mendoza and pressure to reach Santiago meant the flight continued despite the risks. The aircraft followed a longer but traditionally safer southern route through the Andes. Just after 3:20 p.m., turbulence intensified. The crew, confident they had passed Curico, Chile, radioed Santiago Air Traffic Control for descent clearance. Their calculation, however, was fatally flawed. Strong headwinds, poor visibility, and navigational miscalculations had placed them far from the intended approach. Yet, cleared for descent, the plane began to drop into dense cloud cover, still deep in the mountains. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was surprisingly calm. Flight attendants reassured passengers they would be landing soon. Conversations continued. Laughter lingered despite the growing turbulence. Few suspected the danger closing in. Then, as the plane emerged from the clouds, reality struck with brutal clarity. Steep, snow-covered mountain slopes appeared impossibly close. Panic spread instantly. Many passengers instinctively prayed, while others braced for impact. The pilots fought desperately to gain altitude, engines screaming at maximum power, but it was too late. The right wing struck a ridge first, tearing off the tail cone and instantly killing several passengers and crew members, including the navigator and a flight attendant. Moments later, the left wing tore away. One of the propellers sliced through the fuselage. The remaining cabin slid uncontrollably down a steep snowfield, coming to rest on a glacier in a remote valley at roughly 12,020 feet on the Argentine side of the Andes near the Chilean border. The fuselage remained partially intact, a fragile shelter in a landscape of ice, rock, and snow. 12 people had perished in the crash and immediate aftermath. 33 survived, many with severe trauma, head injuries, broken bones, internal wounds, and exposure to sub-freezing temperatures. The plane's white fuselage blended almost seamlessly into the snow, making it nearly invisible to the search planes that would come in vain over the next days. At that moment, the survivors faced the immensity of the Andes: isolation, extreme altitude, and freezing conditions. They were trapped in a place where help might never come. And yet, life persisted inside that broken fuselage. Some were already beginning to emerge as leaders. Two teenage medical students, Roberto Canessa and Gustavo Zerbino, immediately began triage and first aid. Marcelo Perez, the rugby team captain, took charge of morale and organization. Unseen by the world, the survivors of Flight 571 had entered a battle, not just against the mountains, but against time, injury, and the unimaginable choices that lay ahead. As night fell over the Andes, the survivors of Flight 571 faced a brutal reality. The fuselage offered the only shelter against temperatures that plummeted well below freezing and winds that cut through every improvised barrier. Inside, space was almost non-existent. Injured passengers lay huddled among debris, the dead interspersed with the living, while others scrambled to find even a place to sit. Luggage, aircraft seats, and shards of insulation were hastily stacked to block the wind, but the cold penetrated every layer, every bone. The injuries were devastating. Nando Parado, thrown forward in the cabin, suffered severe head trauma and was initially believed dead. Susana Parado, his sister, sustained critical head injuries, while their mother, Eugenia Parado, died from the crash. Rafael Echeverren's leg was catastrophically damaged, with bone and soft tissue shattered beyond conventional treatment. Enrique Platero had a piece of metal lodged in his abdomen. With the guidance of Roberto Canessa and Gustavo Zerbino, the object was removed, though the internal injury remained life-threatening. Even the co-pilot, Dante Hector Laguerra, survived the initial impact, but was critically injured, the instrument panel embedded in his torso. He would die the following day. Amid the physical trauma, the psychological strain was immediate and relentless. Passengers screamed and cried, delirious from shock, pain, and fear. Graziella Mariani, trapped beneath wreckage with fractures in both legs, cried out incoherently throughout the night. Time seemed distorted. Gustavo Zerbino recalled glancing at his watch, thinking daylight had arrived, only to realize evening still held sway. Yet, amid chaos, leadership emerged. Marcelo Perez, the rugby team captain, took control of morale and organization, forming small work groups for critical tasks, tending to the injured, melting snow for water, and securing whatever shelter they could create. Canessa and Zerbino, barely 19 years old, became the emergency doctors, improvising bandages from clothing and seat cushions, triaging injuries, and determining who could survive the night. Liliana Methal, 34, emerged as a maternal figure, caring for the most critically injured and enduring the cold without claiming special treatment for herself. Survivors quickly realized that rescue was not guaranteed. The fuselage blended into the glacier, invisible from above. As night stretched on, fear gave way to grim determination. They would need to endure, to organize, and to survive, because the mountains themselves offered no mercy. By the first dawn, the survivors had learned the harshest lessons of survival. Leadership, resourcefulness, and hope were as crucial as strength. And though the snow and ice outside promised nothing but isolation, the fragile community inside the fuselage would become the crucible in which the impossible decisions of the coming weeks would be forged.
By October 14th, the morning after the crash, the survivors of Flight 571 were fully awake to the harsh reality they were trapped high in the Andes with no immediate hope of rescue. Their makeshift shelter offered limited protection against sub-freezing temperatures and cutting winds. The snow and ice outside stretched endlessly, with no plants, no animals, no sign of life, only rock, ice, and sky. Food supplies were already minimal. Chocolate bars, small jars of jam, tins of mussels and salted almonds, dried plums and dates, and a few scattered candies had to be carefully rationed. Within a week, the provisions ran out. Some survivors attempted to eat leather from belts or shoes, which provided almost no nutrition and often made them sick. Water was equally scarce, and survival depended on snow. Adolfo Fito Strauch developed a method to melt clean snow safely, avoiding contamination from blood or other sources, and this became the primary water supply. Psychologically, the group split into two mentalities. Some, led by Marcelo Perez and Pancho Delgado, retained hope that rescue would come, relying on prayer, optimism, and faith. Others, including Canessa, Zerbino, and Nando Parrado, began planning for the worst. Recognizing that survival might demand extreme measures, conversations about eventualities, once unimaginable, quietly started to emerge. If rescue did not arrive, they would need to consider using the deceased as a source of sustenance.
Even small victories, improvised shelters, melted snow for water, or the care of the most severely injured became lifelines. Survivors gradually moved deceased passengers out of the cabin to create space and reduce the constant psychological strain of seeing the dead alongside the living. Every decision, every task was a balance between hope and pragmatism, between faith and harsh reality. In the days ahead, these lessons would become critical. The Andes had already claimed lives, inflicted suffering, and challenged every instinct. But within the fuselage, amid ice, blood, and broken bones, the survivors were learning the first truths of survival. Organization, leadership, and unyielding determination were as vital as any food or water. The impossible choices of the coming weeks were now only a heartbeat away. By the first week in the Andes, the survivors of Flight 571 faced a grim, unavoidable truth. Food had run out. Chocolate, jam, nuts, dried fruits, all of it gone. The fuselage, once a refuge, now felt like a trap. Starvation loomed over every decision, and the fragile community of survivors confronted a choice that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Around the 8th day, the survivors finally heard news from the outside world. Through a small, makeshift radio, they learned the search for them had been officially called off. The hope of rescue, which had sustained them until now, evaporated in an instant. For some, despair threatened to overwhelm. For others, it forced a grim realization: they would have to take matters into their own hands if they wanted to survive. It began quietly, with hushed discussions among the strongest and most pragmatic. Roberto Canessa argued the only way to survive was to consume the bodies of those who had already died. Drawing on his Catholic faith, he framed the act with a startling analogy. The bodies were physical remnants, the souls already in heaven, much like communion. Others saw his reasoning as necessary, though terrifying. Slowly, the survivors agreed. If they were to live, they would need to eat the dead. The first flesh was taken from the buttocks, offering the most usable meat. They scavenged sharp pieces of glass and razor blades to use as knives.
Meat was laid on the fuselage roof to dry in the sun. Acceptance came gradually. Many hesitated, unable to reconcile morality with survival. But leaders like Canessa and the Strauss cousins set the example, eating first and showing the others that this grim act was the difference between life and death. Survivors ate strategically. Muscle meat provided calories. Fat supplied energy critical for enduring cold and exertion. And organs, liver and kidneys, offered vital nutrients. Fat was sometimes dried into crusts for later consumption. Bodies were stored in snow to slow decomposition, and the group carefully rationed, consuming one body fully before moving to the next. Even amid this, the social structure persisted. Marcelo Perez, before his death, continued organizing tasks, water melting, insulation, medical care, and rationing of remaining provisions. Leadership and cooperation remained essential. Cannibalism was never impulsive, never chaotic. It was methodical, pragmatic, and framed as survival. Psychologically, the choice weighed heavily. Many later described the act as receiving a gift from the dead, a way for their fallen companions to give life even after passing. Religious faith, personal ethics, and mutual consent helped the survivors endure not only the physical hunger, but the moral anguish of what they were doing. This decision, unimaginable to anyone outside that fuselage, became a turning point. The survivors' endurance was no longer just a battle against cold, injury, and isolation. It was a test of conscience, courage, and human adaptability. In the Andes, every choice was life or death, and the first week of starvation had taught them one unflinching truth: survival demanded unimaginable sacrifices. The Andes showed no mercy. On October 29, 1972, over 2 weeks after the crash, nature struck again. A massive avalanche swept down the mountainside, burying the fuselage where the survivors had made their fragile refuge. 8 more lives were lost, including Marcelo Perez, the rugby team captain and primary leader, and Liliana Methol, the maternal figure who had tirelessly cared for the injured. Daniel Maspons, another survivor, also perished in the avalanche. The survivors who remained were trapped beneath the wreckage, suffocating as rapidly depleting oxygen compounded the freezing cold. For 3 days, they endured this imprisonment under snow and ice. Panic, despair, and terror gripped them, yet resourcefulness and courage became their lifeline. Nando Parado, using a metal pole, created an air hole, ensuring they could breathe while trapped. Others worked to stabilize the debris, trying to create pockets of space and prevent further crushing. Survival demanded relentless ingenuity. The mountains allowed no weakness. Food scarcity became even more critical. The bodies of those killed in the avalanche were added to the grim inventory of sustenance. Unlike the earlier weeks, this meat had to be eaten raw and wet, an especially traumatic experience for the survivors. Previously discarded parts, including hands and feet, were consumed as the first bodies ran out or began to rot. Snow and cold were no longer reliable protectors. Decomposition accelerated, forcing survivors into decisions that would haunt them forever. The social structure remained crucial. Leadership had shifted after Marcelo Perez's death, with Daniel Fernandez and cousins Eduardo and Fito Strauss taking primary authority. They organized the processing of bodies, ensured equitable rations, and continued water collection and insulation efforts. Every action was a matter of survival.
Cooperation had become a lifeline, and the ability to suppress fear, disgust, and grief was as important as physical strength. Psychologically, the avalanche marked a turning point. Survivors described a mixture of devastation, anger, and grim determination. They were now painfully aware of the merciless reality of their environment. The Andes would take lives without hesitation. Yet, each day of survival strengthened their resilience. They had already endured more than most could imagine, and the decisions they made, harsh, calculated, and ethically complex, were now the only path forward. By the end of those 3 days, the survivors who emerged from under the snow carried not only the trauma of lost companions, but also an unshakable understanding. Survival required courage beyond instinct, ingenuity beyond training, and a willingness to confront the unimaginable. The avalanche had claimed lives, but it had not yet claimed their spirit.
By early December, the survivors of Flight 571 had endured nearly 2 months in the unforgiving Andes. The avalanche had claimed more lives, food supplies had dwindled, and hope of rescue had long vanished. It became clear that survival required action beyond the fuselage. The strongest and most determined among them would have to attempt the impossible: cross the mountains and seek help. Selected for the expedition were Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa, both young men hardened by weeks of starvation, exposure, and trauma. Antonio Tintin Vizintin initially joined, but turned back to conserve food for the remaining survivors. Numa Turcati, who had refused to eat human flesh for much of the ordeal, was unable to participate due to extreme malnourishment and would eventually perish around day 60. Extra food and rest were allocated to the expeditionaries, giving them the strength needed for the treacherous journey. They prepared meticulously. Clothing was layered and reinforced with scraps from the wreckage, insulation from aircraft material, and, in some reports, fat or skin repurposed for warmth. The expedition would traverse glaciers, snowfields, and jagged ridges, facing extreme cold, thin air at high altitude, and exhaustion that turned every step into agony. For 10 days, Parrado and Canessa ascended and descended the peaks, battling snow, wind, and the ever-present threat of death. They navigated by instinct, memory of the terrain, and sheer determination. Every crevasse was a potential grave, every slope a test of their strength. As starvation gnawed at them, their focus remained absolute. They had to survive to save those left behind. Finally, on December 20th, 1972, they encountered a Chilean muleteer, Sergio Catalan. He did not immediately rescue them, but agreed to return the next day after notifying authorities. To communicate, Parrado and Canessa threw a rock across a river with a note attached, providing Catalan the details he needed to alert rescuers. Catalan rode 10 hours to deliver the news. This extraordinary trek set the stage for the final rescue. Parrado and Canessa had navigated the impossible, transforming desperation into hope. Their courage, endurance, and ingenuity were testament to the human spirit, proving that survival in the harshest environment required not only strength, but unwavering resolve, careful planning, and the will to push beyond fear and exhaustion. The Andes had tested every instinct, every moral boundary, and every ounce of physical and mental stamina. And through it all, these 2 young men became the lifeline that would lead to salvation for the remaining survivors. After 72 grueling days trapped in the Andes, the survivors of Flight 571 were finally rescued. On December 22 and 23, 1972, Chilean helicopters arrived at the crash site, bringing the miraculous ordeal to an end. 16 survivors would emerge from the snow and ice, each bearing the scars, both visible and invisible, of nearly 2.5 months of unimaginable struggle. The final evacuation was a carefully coordinated effort. Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa had crossed the mountains and alerted authorities via the Chilean muleteer Sergio Catalan, whose 10-hour ride to summon help proved decisive. Relief teams flew into the remote glacier valley, navigating the high-altitude terrain to reach those who had endured frostbite, broken bones, starvation, and trauma that few could comprehend. The immediate aftermath was emotionally overwhelming. Survivors, once isolated in the cold silence of the Andes, were reunited with rescuers, journalists, and family. They had endured avalanches, starvation, and injuries that would have claimed most ordinary lives. Yet beyond physical survival, they had confronted ethical and emotional extremes, including the necessity of consuming the deceased to remain alive. Initially, survivors avoided discussing this aspect, knowing the world might not understand.
Public disclosure came soon after. Media coverage revealed the full story, including the decision to resort to cannibalism. While initially shocking, the narrative of survival and human resilience dominated the conversation. The Catholic Church did not condemn the survivors, later offering absolution. Families of the deceased largely forgave the survivors, recognizing that the choices made were necessary to preserve life. The ordeal left an indelible mark. Many survivors wrote books, participated in documentaries, and shared their story to educate and inspire. Some even returned to play rugby matches in Chile, a testament to endurance and the will to reclaim normalcy. Internally, however, the scars remained. Survivor guilt, trauma, and memory of those lost were constant companions. Yet the strength forged in the Andes gave them a perspective few would ever understand. Flight 5711 became more than a crash. It became a story of courage, leadership, and the extremes of human survival. From the fuselage on a remote glacier to the helicopter that finally lifted them to safety, the journey illustrated that survival is never just physical. It is moral, emotional, and profoundly human. The Andes had tested every limit. They had claimed lives and challenged human conscience. Yet in the end, 16 young men and women returned from the mountains as living proof of human endurance. Their story remains a powerful reminder. Even in the coldest, most isolated, and most brutal conditions, the human spirit can endure, adapt, and survive the impossible. But their ordeal leaves a haunting question behind. When survival itself is on the line, how far would any of us be willing to go? Next week, we reveal more unexplained stories, unsolved crimes, and secrets history forgot. Subscribe to dive deep into the extraordinary and the dark corners of our past. Thank you for watching.